The galaxy was burning, and no one was coming to help. Ambassador Thelenvos stood at the observation window of the last Valari station. His thin blue fingers pressed against the cold glass as he watched another refugee ship dock at the crowded port. Behind him, the sounds of crying children and desperate families filled the corridors. His people were dying, and he had run out of options. The Valari Collective had existed for 3,000 years. 7 peaceful species had joined together to explore the stars, share knowledge, and build a civilization based on wisdom and cooperation. They had no weapons. They had no armies. They believed that intelligent beings would always choose peace over war. They were wrong. The Krath Dominion had appeared from the dark regions of space 6 months ago. They were massive insectoid creatures, standing 8 feet tall with armored shells and blade-like limbs. They did not negotiate. They did not accept surrender. They simply consumed everything in their path. Thelenvos had watched the footage from the conquered worlds. He had seen Valari cities reduced to ash. He had seen his people herded into labor camps. He had seen children separated from their parents and never seen again. The Krath were not interested in territory or resources. They wanted slaves. They wanted suffering. They wanted to break every species that was weaker than them, and every species was weaker than them. The ambassador turned away from the window and walked to the communication center. The room was small and dark, filled with flickering screens and exhausted technicians. They had been sending distress calls to every corner of the galaxy for weeks. No one had answered. The other spacefaring civilizations had heard about the Krath. They knew what was coming, and they were too afraid to help. But there was one more option. One desperate, terrifying option. Thelenvos approached the main console and entered a set of coordinates that had been forbidden for centuries. Every species in the galaxy knew about the third planet of the Sol system. They knew about the creatures that lived there. The warnings had been passed down for generations. Do not contact Earth. Do not approach Earth. Do not attract the attention of the humans. The humans came from a world that should not have produced intelligent life. Their planet was a nightmare of extreme temperatures, violent storms, earthquakes, and volcanic eruptions. The gravity was crushing. The atmosphere was corrosive. Deadly radiation bombarded the surface every day. And yet, somehow, life had evolved there. Life that was incredibly strong. Life that was incredibly dangerous. The humans were predators. They had forward-facing eyes, like hunters. They had teeth designed for tearing flesh. They could run for hours without stopping, chasing their prey until it collapsed from exhaustion. They healed from injuries that would kill other species. They could survive in environments that would destroy anyone else. But the most frightening thing about humans was their minds. They were creative. They were adaptable. They were relentless. When they encountered a problem, they did not accept it. They solved it. When they faced an obstacle, they did not go around it. They went through it. They had invented weapons that could split atoms. They had traveled to their own moon using nothing but primitive rockets and raw determination. And they were violent. Their history was written in blood. They had spent thousands of years fighting each other, developing new and terrible ways to kill. War was part of their nature. Death was their constant companion. Every species in the galaxy agreed. The humans were too dangerous to contact. If they ever left their solar system, if they ever discovered that other life existed, they would conquer everything. They would become the greatest threat the galaxy had ever known. But Thelenvos was out of options. He pressed the transmit button and spoke into the microphone. His voice was steady, but his hearts were pounding. This is Ambassador Thelenvos of the Valari Collective. We are requesting immediate assistance. Our civilization is under attack. Millions of our people have been killed or enslaved. We have no military. We have no weapons. We cannot defend ourselves. Please, if anyone can hear this message, we need help." He attached the coordinates of the station and the footage from the conquered worlds. Then he sent the signal toward the Sol system and waited. 6 days later, Commander Grace Holloway was drinking coffee in her quarters aboard the patrol vessel Steadfast when the alarm sounded. She set down her cup and moved quickly to the bridge. Grace was 43 years old, with short gray hair and a scar across her left cheek from a piece of shrapnel during the Mars insurgency. She had been a soldier for 20 years. She had seen enough death to last several lifetimes. She was tired, but she was still sharp. "What do we have?" she asked as she entered the bridge. Lieutenant Kyle Bennett looked up from his console. He was young, maybe 25, with nervous eyes. "Commander, we've received a transmission from outside the solar system. It's not from any human source." Grace stopped walking. "Say that again." "It's alien, ma'am. The signal is definitely alien." The bridge went silent. Every officer turned to look at Grace. Humanity had been searching for evidence of extraterrestrial life for centuries. They had found nothing. And now, on an ordinary Tuesday, a message had arrived from the stars. Grace walked to the main screen and played the transmission. The image of Thelanvos appeared, blue-skinned and fragile-looking, with large dark eyes and a voice that trembled with fear. Behind him, the sounds of chaos and suffering were clear. When the footage from the conquered worlds began to play, Grace felt something cold settle in her chest. She watched cities burning. She watched families running. She watched children crying for parents who would never come. The creatures attacking them were massive and brutal, tearing through everything with savage efficiency. The transmission ended. The bridge remained silent. Grace turned to her communications officer. "Send this to Fleet Command. Priority 1. Tell Admiral Reyes I need to speak with him immediately." 12 hours later, Grace stood before the Earth Defense Coalition Military Council. 20 admirals and generals sat around a curved table, watching the same footage she had seen. Some of them looked horrified. Some of them looked skeptical. All of them looked uncertain. Admiral Victor Reyes, a broad-shouldered man with a thick gray beard, spoke first. "The risks are enormous. We don't know anything about this region of space. We don't know how many enemies we'd be facing. We don't even know if this is real or some kind of trap." "It's not a trap," Grace said quietly. "You saw the footage. That suffering is real." "Even so," another general said, "why should we risk human lives for strangers? We have our own problems, our own people to protect." Grace looked at the screen, which still showed a frozen image of a Valari child crying in the ruins of her home. "Because that's who we are," she said. "Because if we ignore this, if we turn away from people who are begging for help, then we're not worth saving ourselves." The debate continued for hours. But in the end, the vote was clear. Humanity would answer the call. 3 weeks later, Private First Class Danny Ortiz sat in the cargo bay of a transport ship, checking his rifle for the 100th time. He was 22 years old, from a small town in Texas. He had joined the Marines because he wanted to make a difference. He had never expected to make that difference in another galaxy. Beside him, Corporal Megan Shaw was reading a letter from her younger sister. She was 26, quiet and serious, with steady hands and a reputation for staying calm under fire. "You scared?" Danny asked. Megan folded the letter and put it in her pocket. "Yes," she said simply. "But we're going anyway." Danny nodded. That was the human way. Feel the fear. Go anyway. The fleet jumped to faster-than-light speed, carrying 43 ships and 12,000 soldiers toward the unknown. Behind them, Earth grew smaller and smaller until it disappeared entirely. Ahead of them, a desperate people waited and prayed for a miracle. The Deathworlders were coming. The human fleet dropped out of faster-than-light speed at the edge of Valari space, and the refugees saw them coming. Thelmvos stood at the observation deck of the station, surrounded by frightened civilians who had gathered to watch. They had all heard the stories about Deathworlders. They had all been taught to fear them. And now, 43 ships from Earth were approaching their home. The vessels were unlike anything the Valari had ever seen. They were heavy and angular, covered in thick armor plating and bristling with weapons. They moved with a kind of aggressive purpose that made the Valari engineers gasp. These were not exploration ships. These were not trading vessels. These were machines built for war. They actually came, whispered a young Valari mother, holding her child close. The Deathworlders actually came. May the ancestors protect us, an elderly male said, making a gesture of prayer. Telenvos said nothing. He had invited these creatures here. Whatever happened next was his responsibility. The lead ship, the Steadfast, requested permission to dock. Telenvos granted it. He walked to the docking bay with a small delegation of Valari officials, his heart pounding in his chest. The other officials looked terrified. Some of them were trembling, but they stood their ground because their ambassador had asked them to. The airlock opened with a hiss of pressure, and the first humans stepped onto the station. Commander Grace Holloway led the group. She was shorter than Thelmvos had expected, but there was something about her that made him want to step backward. Her eyes were sharp and focused, like a predator evaluating its surroundings. Her movements were controlled and efficient. Even standing still, she looked dangerous. Behind her came a squad of soldiers in heavy armor, carrying weapons that looked crude but deadly. They scanned the room with those forward-facing eyes, checking for threats. The Valari officials flinched under their gaze. But then something unexpected happened. Grace. Holloway smiled. It was a small smile, tired and genuine, and it transformed her entire face. She extended her hand toward Telenvos in a gesture he did not recognize. "Ambassador," she said, her voice warm. "I'm Commander Grace Holloway. We received your message. We're here to help." Telenvos stared at the extended hand. A Valari advisor leaned close and whispered, "It's a human greeting." They clasped hands to show they are not holding weapons. Slowly, carefully, Telenvos reached out and took Grace's hand. Her grip was firm but gentle. Her skin was warm, almost hot by Valari standards. And up close, he could see something in her eyes that he had not expected. Kindness. "Thank you," he said, his voice cracking. "Thank you for coming." Grace nodded. "Show us where we can help." Over the next several hours, the station transformed. Human soldiers began unloading crates of supplies from their ships. Food, medicine, blankets, water purification systems. The Valari watched in amazement as humans carried loads that would require machines for any other species. A single human soldier lifted a crate that 3 Valari adults could not move together. Dr. Henry Vance, the fleet's chief medical officer, set up a field hospital in one of the larger cargo bays. He was a tall man with gentle hands and tired eyes. He had been a doctor for 15 years, first in emergency rooms on Earth, then in military hospitals during the Mars insurgency. He had seen every kind of injury. He had saved thousands of lives, and he was determined to save thousands more. The first Valari patients were hesitant. They were afraid of the human doctor, afraid of his strange instruments and his alien appearance. But Henry spoke softly and moved slowly, explaining everything he did. When a young Valari child with a broken arm began to cry, Henry knelt down to her level and made funny faces until she laughed. "You're going to be okay," he told her through the translator. "I promise." He worked for 36 hours straight, treating burns, setting bones, and adapting human medical techniques for Valari physiology. When an elderly Valari female asked why he was doing this, Why he was helping strangers from another world, Henry paused. "Because I'm a doctor," he said simply. "And you needed help." The elderly female reached out and touched his hand. "You are not what we expected," she said. Henry smiled. "We get that a lot." Meanwhile, Grace met with the Lenvos and the Valari Council in a private chamber. The room was tense. Not all of the council members were happy about the human presence. An elder named Sarathul stood at the far end of the table, his dark eyes fixed on Grace with obvious distrust. "You bring weapons onto our station," Sarathul said. "You bring soldiers. How do we know you are not simply another conqueror?" Grace met his gaze without flinching. "You don't," she said honestly. "You have no reason to trust us except our actions. So watch what we do. Judge us by that. The Krath will come," Sarathul continued. "They will bring hundreds of ships. They will destroy everything. What can 43 vessels do against such a force?" "Fight," Grace said. Sarathul made a sound of contempt. "You will die." "Maybe," Grace admitted. "But we won't run. And we won't let them take these people without a battle." Thelenvos stepped forward. "Commander, the Krath have never been defeated. Every species that has faced them has fallen. What makes you believe humans can succeed where everyone else has failed?" Grace was quiet for a moment. Then she spoke. "On our world, there is an old story. A small group of soldiers was trapped in a narrow pass, facing an army of thousands. They knew they could not win. They knew they would die. But they fought anyway, because they were protecting the people behind them. They held that pass for 3 days, and they gave their lives so others could escape." She looked around the room at the Valari faces, at their fear and their doubt. "That's what humans do," she said. "When something matters, we fight for it. Even when we're afraid. Even when the odds are impossible. We fight because giving up is worse than losing." The room was silent. Then a young Valari officer stepped forward. "I believe her," she said. "I have watched them. They carry our wounded. They feed our children. They treat us with kindness when they have no reason to. These are not conquerors." One by one, other Valari began to nod. Even Sarathul, though he remained skeptical, did not object. Thelenvos turned to Grace. "What do you need from us?" "Information," Grace said. "Everything you know about the Krath. Their ships, their tactics, their weaknesses. We need to understand what we're fighting." "They have no weaknesses," Sarathul said bitterly. Grace smiled that small, tired smile again. "Everything has weaknesses. We just have to find them." That night, Danny Ortiz walked through the refugee section of the station. He was off duty, but he could not sleep. The faces of the Valori haunted him. They were so fragile, so afraid. And they looked at the human soldiers with a mixture of terror and hope that made his chest tight. A small Valari child was sitting alone in a corner, hugging her knees. She looked up when Danny approached, her large eyes filling with fear. Danny stopped and knelt down slowly. He did not speak her language, but he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small candy bar. He held it out to her with a gentle smile. The child hesitated. Then, slowly, she reached out and took the candy. She looked at it curiously, then back at Danny. He mimed eating, and she understood. She took a small bite, and her eyes went wide with surprise. Then she smiled, a tiny, beautiful smile that broke Danny's heart. "It's going to be okay," he said, even though he knew she could not understand. "We're going to protect you." The next morning, the Krath sent their message. It was broadcast on all frequencies, in all languages. The face of a Krath commander filled the screens, massive and terrifying, with mandibles clicking as it spoke. "Valari Station, you have accepted the protection of the humans. This changes nothing. Surrender now, or be destroyed. You have 1 day to comply." The station went silent. The Valari looked at each other with despair. This was the end. The Krath were coming, but then Grace Holloway walked to the communication console. She straightened her uniform, looked directly into the camera, and pressed the transmit button. "This is Commander Grace Holloway of the Earth Defense Coalition. The Valari are under our protection. They will not surrender. They will not be enslaved. If you want them, you will have to go through us." She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was cold. "And I promise you this, you will not enjoy the experience. This is your only warning." She cut the transmission. Silence filled the station. Then, slowly, the Valari began to stand. They looked at the humans with new eyes. Not with fear, not with doubt, not with hope. The Krath fleet changed course toward the station. 200 warships, bristling with weapons, hungry for blood. They did not know what was waiting for them. The Krath fleet appeared on sensors at dawn. 200 warships moving in a massive wave toward the station. On the bridge of the Steadfast, Grace Holloway watched them approach and felt no fear. She had been afraid many times in her life. She had learned to work through it. "All ships, report status," she said calmly. One by one, the human vessels confirmed ready. 43 ships against 200. The math was terrible. But Grace had studied the intercepted data on Krath tactics. She had spent the entire night developing a plan with Admiral Reyes, and she had learned something important. The Krath fought like a swarm. They relied on numbers and aggression. They charged at their enemies in overwhelming waves, confident that their superior numbers would crush any resistance. They had never faced an enemy that refused to break. They had never faced humans. "Remember the plan," Grace said over the fleet-wide channel. "We don't need to destroy them all. We need to make them bleed. We need to show them that fighting us costs more than they're willing to pay." The Steadfast shuddered as the engines powered up. Around her, the crew moved with quiet efficiency. They were scared. She could see it in their eyes. But they trusted her, and they would follow her into hell if she asked. The Krath opened fire first. Massive energy beams lanced across space, striking the human fleet. The ship Valiant took a direct hit to its forward section, and Grace watched the damage reports scroll across her screen. 30 crew dead in an instant. But the Valiant kept fighting. Its captain, a woman named Rosa Gutierrez, simply ordered damage control and returned fire. The human weapons were different from anything the Krath had encountered. They used kinetic projectiles instead of energy beams. Massive slugs of metal accelerated to incredible speeds. The Krath shields were designed to absorb energy. They were not designed to stop physical impacts. The first Krath ship exploded in a ball of fire as a human railgun tore through its hull. Then another. Then another. The Krath commander hesitated. This was not supposed to happen. These small, primitive ships were supposed to run. They were supposed to scatter like every other species. Instead, they were advancing directly into the Krath formation, taking hits that would destroy other vessels and continuing to fight. "All ships, attack Patent Delta," Grace ordered. "Focus fire on their command vessels. Cut the head off the snake." The human fleet split into 3 groups, weaving through the Krath formation with impossible precision. The Krath ships were larger and more powerful, but they were also slower. The human vessels danced around them, striking at weak points and then withdrawing before the Krath could respond. The Steadfast shuddered again as another blast hit its shields. Alarms blared. Smoke filled the corridors. But the ship held together, and Grace kept giving orders. On the station itself, Danny Ortiz heard the sounds of battle even through the thick walls. He was stationed in the lower levels with his squad, guarding the refugee sections. Megan Shaw stood beside him, her rifle ready, her face calm. "They're coming," she said quietly. "Boarding parties." Danny nodded. He had known this moment would come. The Krath would try to take the station from the inside while their fleet attacked from outside. It was a smart strategy. It would have worked against any other species. The first craft breached the hull 3 levels below. They cut through the metal with specialized tools and poured into the corridors. 8 feet of armored fury with blade-like limbs and mandibles that clicked with hunger. Sergeant Carl Jeffries led the squad to intercept. He was a veteran of 3 wars, a man who had seen everything and feared nothing. He rounded a corner and came face to face with the first Krath warrior. The creature moved faster than anything Danny had ever seen. Its blade arm swept across Carl's chest, cutting through his armor like paper. Carl went down without a sound, his blood spreading across the floor. "No!" Danny shouted. He opened fire. The bullets sparked against the Krath's armor, but did not penetrate. The creature turned toward him, its compound eyes gleaming with malice. Then Megan was beside him. "Aim for the joints," she shouted. "The armor is weak at the joints." Danny shifted his aim and fired again. This time, the bullets tore through the soft tissue where the Krath's arm met its body. The creature screamed, a high-pitched sound that hurt Danny's ears, and staggered backward. More Krath were coming. The corridor filled with them, a nightmare of clicking mandibles and flashing blades. "Fall back," Megan ordered. "Fall back to checkpoint 7. The squad retreated, firing as they went. Private Lisa Torres threw a grenade, and the explosion briefly slowed the Krath advance. But they kept coming, stepping over their own dead, driven by a hunger that knew no fear. Danny saw a flash of movement to his left. A Valari civilian, a young female, was trapped in a side corridor. A Krath warrior was advancing on her, its blades raised for the kill. Without thinking, Danny ran. He tackled the Krath from behind, wrapping his arms around its armored neck. The creature thrashed wildly, trying to throw him off. Danny held on with all his strength, screaming with the effort. Megan appeared beside him and jammed her knife into the joint at the Krath's neck. The creature went limp and collapsed. Danny fell with it, gasping for breath. The ValorHFY stared at him with wide, terrified eyes. "Run," Danny said. "Get to the shelters. Go." She ran. The battle continued for hours. The human soldiers fought room by room, corridor by corridor, pushing the Krath back step by bloody step. They discovered that the Krath feared fire, that they would hesitate when flames blocked their path. They learned that the Krath communicated through chemical signals, and that disrupting those signals with smoke grenades caused confusion in their ranks. They paid for every lesson in blood in the maintenance tunnels. Megan Shaw led a flanking maneuver with 6 volunteers. They crawled through narrow spaces that the Krath could not follow, emerging behind the enemy lines. They attacked from the rear, disrupting the Krath formation and buying time for the main defense. Megan took a blade across her shoulder during the fighting. She wrapped it with a field bandage and kept going. There was no time to stop. There was no time to be wounded. In the medical bay, Dr. Henry Vance worked with desperate speed. The wounded were arriving faster than he could treat them. Human soldiers and Valari civilians lay side by side, bleeding and crying out in pain. Henry moved from patient to patient, stitching wounds, stopping bleeding, saving lives. A young Valari healer named Ilorin worked beside him. She had never seen so much blood. She had never heard so many screams. But she watched the human doctor and did exactly as he instructed. "You're doing great," Henry told her between patients. "Just keep going. Don't stop." Ilorin nodded and bent over the next patient. She would not stop. Not while the human doctor was still fighting in space. The battle reached its climax. The Krath fleet had lost 40 ships, an unthinkable number. They had never lost so many in a single engagement. But they still outnumbered the humans 3-1, and they were pressing the attack. The Steadfast took a critical hit. The hull was breached in 3 places. Ensign Paula Grant led the damage control team, sealing the gaps with emergency foam while the ship shook around her. She was 23 years old, and she had never been more terrified in her life. But she kept working, because the ship needed her. "We're losing life support on Deck 4, someone shouted. "Then evacuate Deck 4. Paula shouted back. "Keep this ship flying." Grace watched the battle on her screens and made a decision. The Krath command ship was at the center of their formation, protected by a wall of lesser vessels. If they could destroy it, the Krath fleet would fall into chaos. "All ships, focus fire on the command vessel," she ordered. "Everything we have, now." The human fleet turned as one. They broke through the Krath formation with savage determination, taking terrible punishment, but refusing to stop. Railguns fired in coordinated volleys, tearing through the protective ships one by one. The Krath command ship tried to retreat, but it was too late. The combined fire of the human fleet struck its engines, its weapons, its bridge. The massive vessel broke apart in a spectacular explosion that lit up the darkness of space. The Krath fleet hesitated. Their commander was dead. Their communications were in chaos. And these strange, terrible creatures from Earth were still coming. For the first time in their history, the Krath retreated. On the station, the remaining boarding parties found themselves cut off. Without support from their fleet, they were overwhelmed. Danny Ortiz fired the shot that killed the last Krath in the refugee section. Then he sat down on the floor, his hands shaking, and stared at the bodies around him. 17 human ships had been destroyed. Over 200 soldiers were dead. Countless more were wounded. But the station still stood. The refugees were still alive. They had won. That evening, Grace Holloway sat alone in a small observation room, staring out at the stars. In her hand, she held a datapad with the names of everyone who had died. She read each name silently, committing it to memory. Felon single quotes Voss found her there. "Commander," he said softly, "I came to thank you. What your people did today was extraordinary." Grace did not look up. 217, she said. "That's how many we lost today. 217 people who will never go home." Thelanvos was silent. On Valari, death was accepted with quiet resignation. It was part of life. But he was beginning to. The victory at the station changed everything, but it was only the beginning. The Krath Dominion still controlled dozens of Valari worlds. Millions of civilians remained under occupation, suffering in labor camps, waiting for rescue that they believed would never come. Admiral Victor Reyes stood before a holographic map of Valari space and outlined the next phase of the campaign. "We go on the offensive," he said. "We liberate every occupied world. We free every prisoner. We push the Krath back until they have nothing left." The Valari Council listened in stunned silence. No species had ever pushed back against the Krath. No one had ever tried. "This will take months," Thelanvos said quietly. "Perhaps years. And the cost will be high," Grace finished. "We know. We're going anyway." That was the human way. Acknowledge the cost. Pay it anyway. The campaign began with the agricultural world of Shentel. It was a beautiful planet of golden fields and gentle hills, where Valari farmers had grown food for half the collective. Now, those farmers were slaves. They worked in the fields from dawn to dark, harvesting crops that fed the Krath war machine. Anyone who faltered was killed. Anyone who resisted was made an example. Lieutenant Cody Marsh led the ground assault. He was 28 years old, with a quiet voice and steady hands. He had grown up on a farm in Kansas, and something about seeing farmers enslaved made him burn with a cold fury. The dropships came at night, screaming down through the atmosphere while Krath anti-aircraft fire lit up the sky. 3 ships were hit before they landed. The soldiers inside died before they could fight. Cody's ship made it to the ground. He led his platoon out into the darkness, moving fast and low toward the nearest labor camp. The Krath guards never saw them coming. The first strike was silent. Human soldiers with knives and suppressed weapons eliminated the outer guards without a sound. Then the main gates were blown, and the real fighting began. The Krath were fierce, but they were not prepared for an assault on their own territory. They had grown used to easy victories, to enemies who cowered and fled. These humans did neither. They advanced with relentless precision, clearing buildings, eliminating resistance, never stopping. Cody found the main prisoner barracks near dawn. The doors were locked, and the Valari inside were huddled together in terror, listening to the sounds of battle. They had been told that the humans were monsters, that they were worse than the Krath. They had been told many lies. Cody broke down the door and stepped inside. He was covered in dirt and blood, his armor scarred from combat. He looked like a nightmare, but his voice was gentle. "It's okay," he said through his translator. "We're here to take you home." An elderly Valari male could not walk. His legs had been broken by the Krath and had healed badly. Cody lifted him onto his back and carried him 3 miles to the evacuation point. "Why?" the old man asked, his voice trembling. "Why would you do this for strangers?" Cody did not know how to answer. It was simply what you did. You saw someone suffering, and you helped. That was all. Shentel was liberated in 4 days. The surviving farmers stood in their fields and watched the human ships depart, carrying the wounded to safety. Some of them cried. Some of them simply stared. None of them would ever forget. The campaign continued. On the industrial moon of Kethros, the Krath had built a massive communications hub that coordinated their forces across the sector. Destroying it would blind them, disrupting their ability to send reinforcements. Sergeant Megan Shaw led the assault. She had been promoted after her commanding officer was killed at the station. She had not wanted the promotion. She had not wanted to lead. But people were counting on her, so she did what needed to be done. The raid was planned for night. 20 soldiers against a garrison of 300 Krath. The odds were impossible. But Megan had learned that impossible was just another word for difficult. They approached through underground tunnels that the Krath did not know existed. A Valari engineer named Torn Vek had provided the maps. He had worked in this facility before the invasion, and he knew every corridor, every access point, every weakness. "Thank you," Megan told him before the mission. "You didn't have to help us." Tornvek looked at her with his large, dark eyes. "You came across the galaxy to save my people," he said. "The least I can do is show you the way." The assault began at midnight. Megan's team emerged from the tunnels inside the facility, behind the main defenses. They moved fast, planting explosives on critical systems while the Krath scrambled to respond. Danny Ortiz was part of the team. He had volunteered for every dangerous mission since the station, driven by something he could not name. He was not trying to die. He was trying to prove that Carl Jeffries' death had meant something. The Krath found them before they could finish. A patrol stumbled onto the team in the central control room. Danny shouted a warning and opened fire, but the Krath were already charging. One of them struck Private Amy Schultz, throwing her across the room. She did not get up. Danny felt something cold settle in his chest. Not again. Not again. He charged at the Krath that had killed Amy, screaming with rage. His rifle jammed, so he used it as a club, smashing it against the creature's armored head. The Krath staggered, and Danny pulled his knife. He found the joint at the neck, just as Megan had taught him, and drove the blade home. The Krath fell. Danny stood over its body, breathing hard, covered in blood that was not his own. "We need to move," Megan said, grabbing his arm. "The charges are set. We have 3 minutes." They ran. The explosives detonated behind them, tearing the communications hub apart. The fireball was visible from orbit. When they reached the extraction point, Danny sat down in the dirt and stared at nothing. Megan sat beside him. She did not say anything. There was nothing to say. That night, he wrote a letter to Amy's parents. He told them she had died bravely, that she had saved his life, that she had been a hero. He did not tell them about the sound she made when she hit the wall. He did not tell them about the look in her eyes. Some things you carried along. The weeks turned into months. The human forces liberated world after world, freeing prisoners, destroying Krath installations, pushing the enemy back. Each victory came at a cost. Each planet left scars. Dr. Henry Vance established field hospitals on every liberated world. He trained Valari medics, teaching them human techniques that saved lives they would have lost before. Ellerin, the young healer from the station, became his best student. She worked beside him through endless shifts, learning, growing, becoming something more than she had been. "You're going to be a great doctor," Henry told her one evening. As they treated the last patients of the day, Ellerin looked at him with surprise. "I am not a doctor. I am only a healer." "There's no only about it," Henry said. "Healing is the most important work there is." Ellerin thought about that for a long time. The war took its toll on everyone. But some wounds were harder to see. Commander Grace Holloway received the news on a quiet afternoon, while she was reviewing supply reports in her quarters. Her younger brother, Lieutenant Eric Holloway, had been commanding a patrol ship on the outer edge of the campaign. His vessel had been covering a civilian evacuation when a Krath fleet dropped out of faster-than-light speed directly on top of them. Eric had ordered the evacuation ships to run while he held the enemy back. He had bought them 20 minutes. It was enough. The civilians escaped. Eric did not. Grace read the report twice. Then she set down the datapad, closed her eyes, and sat in silence for a very long time. When she returned to duty, no one saw her cry. But the crew noticed that she kept a photograph on her console now, a picture of a young man with her same gray eyes and a bright, easy smile. She did not talk about it. She simply kept working, kept planning, kept fighting. That was how you honored the dead. You finished what they started. The Valari watched the humans throughout the campaign. They saw soldiers carry wounded enemies to medical stations. They saw officers mourn for fallen soldiers. They saw humans share their food, their water, their blankets with civilians who had nothing. They began to understand something important. The humans were not fighting because they enjoyed violence. They were not fighting for territory or resources or power. They were fighting because they believed it was right. They were fighting because they could not stand to see innocent people suffer. They were fighting because they cared. Thelenvos spoke with Grace one evening, after a particularly brutal day of combat. "Your people are remarkable," he said. "You carry so much pain, but you keep going." Grace was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Grief is not weakness. It's the price we pay for love. And love is what makes us strong." Thelenvos did not fully understand, but he was learning. The campaign reached its final stage. The Krath had been pushed back to Valari Prime, the homeworld of the Collective. They had gathered every remaining ship, every surviving soldier, for one last stand. If they took the planet, everything would be lost. If the humans won, the war would be over. Admiral Rias gathered his officers for a final briefing. The map showed the Krath fleet surrounding Valari Prime, a massive wall of ships protecting the planet. "This is it," he said. "Everything we fought for comes down to this. We win here, or we lose everything." He looked around the room at the tired faces, the scarred bodies, the determined eyes. "I won't lie to you. Some of us won't survive this." The final battle began at dawn over Valari Prime. the Krath had gathered everything they had left. 150 warships formed a wall around the planet, protecting the ground forces that occupied the surface. Warlord Krax the Unbroken, the most feared commander in the Dominion, led the defense personally. He had never lost a battle. He had never been driven from a world he claimed. He intended to keep that record. Admiral Victor Reyes stood on the bridge of the carrier Endurance and surveyed his forces. The human fleet had been joined by reinforcements from Earth, volunteers who had heard the stories of the campaign and demanded to fight. They were not enough to match the Krath numbers, but they were enough to try. All ships, begin approach, Reyes ordered. Stay in formation. Trust your training. And remember why we're here. The space between the fleets lit up with weapons fire. Energy beams and kinetic slugs crisscrossed the darkness, tearing through shields and hulls. Ships exploded in brilliant flashes. Debris scattered across the battlefield. The Steadfast was at the front of the human formation, as always. Grace Holloway stood on the bridge, calm and focused, giving orders with the precision of a surgeon. A hit from a Krath beam weapon nearly knocked her off her feet, but she grabbed the console and kept talking. "Damage report," she said. "Hull breach on Deck 7. Casualty count unknown. Engines at 80%. Keep firing. Don't stop." On the planet below, the ground assault had already begun. Danny Ortiz was among the first soldiers to hit the dirt, dropping from a transport ship into the streets of the capital city. The Krath had fortified every building, every intersection, every rooftop. The fighting was brutal from the first moment. Danny had changed over the months of combat. He was harder now, quieter. The boy from Texas who had been scared on the transport ship was gone. In his place was a sergeant who had seen friends die and enemies fall, who knew the cost of war and paid it without complaint. He led his squad through the burning streets, clearing buildings one by one. The Krath fought with desperate fury, knowing that this was their last stand. They would not surrender. They would not retreat. They would kill or be killed. Private First Class Marcus Young, the youngest member of Danny's squad, took a blade across the arm during a close-quarters fight. Danny patched the wound in a doorway while Krath fire rained down around them. "I'm okay, Sarge," Marcus said through gritted teeth. "I can still fight." "I know you can," Danny said. "But stay behind me. No more heroes today." Megan Shaw commanded a company holding the northern ridge above the city. The high ground was essential for artillery support, and the Krath knew it. They threw wave after wave of soldiers at her position. Trying to break through, Megan walked among her troops during lulls in the fighting, checking on the wounded, giving encouragement, making sure everyone had ammunition. She was exhausted. They all were. But exhaustion did not matter. The mission mattered. "They're coming again," someone shouted. Megan raised her rifle. "Hold the line. Nobody falls back. Nobody gives up." The Krath charged. The humans opened fire. The ridge turned into a killing ground. In the basement of a shattered hospital, Dr. Henry Vance worked by candlelight. The power had been cut hours ago. The equipment was failing, and the wounded kept coming. Ilaren worked beside him, her hands steady despite the chaos above. She had become a true healer, just as Henry had predicted. She saved lives that would have been lost without her. A young human soldier was brought in with severe burns across his chest. Henry examined him quickly and shook his head. There was nothing he could do. The damage was too severe. Ilaren looked at the soldier's face. He was so young. He had come across the galaxy to save her people. And now he was dying. She took his hand and held it gently. "Thank you," she whispered in his language. Words she had learned from Henry. "Thank you for coming." The soldier smiled. Just a little, and then he was gone. On the surface, Warlord Krax grew impatient. The battle was taking too long. The humans were supposed to break. All species broke when they faced the Krath. But these creatures kept fighting, kept dying, kept coming back. He made a decision that would change everything. Krax descended to the planet personally, landing in the central plaza of the capital. He stood 9 feet tall, his armored body covered with the trophies of 1,000 victories. His blade arms gleamed in the firelight. He was death incarnate. "I challenge the humans!" His voice boomed across the battlefield, amplified by speakers. "Send your leader. Let us finish this with honor." The fighting paused. Both sides turned to watch. Grace Holloway heard the challenge on her communication system. She looked at the screen showing the massive Krath warlord and made a decision that would define the war. "Land my shuttle in the plaza," she ordered. "Commander." "You can't be serious," Lieutenant Bennett said. "He'll kill you." "Maybe," Grace said. "But if I don't face him, they'll never respect us. They'll never stop." She walked off the bridge without another word. The shuttle landed in the plaza, and Grace stepped out alone. She was a small figure against the backdrop of burning buildings, dwarfed by the massive Krath warlord. She carried a combat knife in one hand and nothing else. Krax looked down at her with contempt. "This is what the humans send? A female? A tiny creature with a blade no longer than my claw?" Grace did not respond. She simply walked forward, her eyes fixed on the warlord. The duel began without ceremony. Krax swung one of his massive blade arms, expecting to cut her in half. Grace dove under the blow, moving faster than seemed possible for someone so small. She came up inside his guard and drove her knife into the joint at his knee. Krax roared in pain and staggered. He swept his other arm at her, catching her across the shoulder. The blow threw her 10 feet, and she hit the ground hard. The Valari watching held their breath. The humans gripped their weapons. Danny Ortiz took a step forward, but Megan grabbed his arm. "Wait," she whispered. "Trust her." Grace stood up. Her left arm hung at a strange angle, clearly broken. Blood ran down her face from a cut on her forehead. But she did not run. She did not scream. She simply raised her knife and walked forward again. Krax was confused. This was not how prey behaved. This was not how anything behaved. He had broken her arm. He had drawn her blood. She should be crawling, begging for mercy. Instead, she was attacking. He swung at her again, but he was slower now, favoring his injured leg. Grace dodged the blow and drove her knife into the joint at his elbow. He screamed and dropped one of his blade arms. "Impossible," he growled. "You cannot defeat me. I am Krax the Unbroken." Grace looked up at him, her eyes cold and hard. "Everyone breaks eventually," she said. She charged at him one final time. He caught her with his remaining blade arm, pinning her against the wall. The blade cut into her side, and she gasped in pain. But she did not stop. She raised her knife and drove it into the gap at his throat, the only vulnerable point in his armor. Krax the Unbroken fell. The plaza went silent. The Krath soldiers stared in disbelief. Their warlord, the greatest warrior in the Dominion, was dead, killed by a small, fragile creature that should not have survived the first blow. Grace stood over his body, swaying on her feet. Blood dripped from her wounds onto the stone, but she was still standing. "Your warlord is dead," she said, her voice carrying across the battlefield. "Your fleet is failing. Your empire is falling. You can keep fighting and die, or you can surrender and live. Choose." The Krath did not surrender gracefully. They did not know how. But without their leader, without their command structure, they broke. They scattered. The humans and Valari pressed the advantage, driving them back until there were no more enemies to fight. By nightfall, Valari Prime was free. The celebration was quiet and exhausted. Too many had died for there to be joy. but there was relief and gratitude, and a sense that something important had been accomplished. Ambassador Thelanvos addressed the galaxy from the steps of the Valari Council building. Behind him, human soldiers stood guard, tired and wounded but unbroken. "We called them monsters," he said, his voice broadcast to every corner of known space. "We were taught to fear them, to hide from them, to never seek their attention. But when the darkness came, when our civilization was burning and no one would help, they answered our call." He paused and looked back at the humans. "They bled for us. They died for us. They carried our children and mourned our dead. They fought not for conquest or power, but because they could not stand to see innocent people suffer. They are not monsters. They are the finest beings I have ever known." His voice broke slightly, but he continued. "To the humans of Earth, on behalf of the Valari Collective and every species you have saved, thank you. Thank you for your courage. Thank you for your compassion. Thank you for teaching us that strength and kindness can exist in the same heart." Danny Ortiz returned to Earth 3 months later, a medal on his chest and new scars on his body. His mother met him at the spaceport, crying and laughing at the same time. He held her for a long time and did not let go. Megan Shaw visited Carl Jeffries' family. She told them how he had died, bravely, protecting his squad. She told them that she thought about him every day, and that she would carry his memory for the rest of her life. Dr. Henry Vance stayed on Valari Prime to help rebuild their medical system. Ellerin became his partner, and together they trained a new generation of healers.